Welcome to Elizabeth's Stories. Today, we follow Miriam Sloane, a resilient grandmother dismissed by her daughter who reclaims her dignity, confronts betrayal, and redefines her legacy through love and strength. Subscribe and hit the bell for weekly tales of truth and empowerment. Share your thoughts below. Let's start the stories. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the scent of polished wood and secrets. The kind of room where truths were buried under layers of legal jargon, where signatures were more powerful than words. I sat in a high-backed chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture straight despite the weight of 72 years pressing against my spine. The walnut table gleamed under the soft glow of a chandelier, its light too perfect, too controlled, as if it had been instructed to reveal nothing. Across from me, my daughter Caroline sat with her legs crossed, her crimson nails tapping a silent rhythm against her leather portfolio. She didn't look at me. She hadn't looked at me, not really, in years. She doesn't understand anything anymore. Caroline said, her voice sharp and clear, slicing through the room, as if I were a ghost at my own funeral. We'll just explain it all to her again. Slowly. The words hung in the air, heavy as the velvet curtains framing the window. I was right there, sitting not 3 feet from her, my eyes fixed on the pen that lay like a challenge on the table. I'd walked through the door on my own, shaken, the lawyer's hand sat without assistance. Yet in her mind, I was already gone, a husk to be managed, a name to be signed away. I felt the heat of her dismissal not just in her words, but in the way she tilted her head toward the lawyer, Cameron Feldman, as if I were no longer part of the conversation. Feldman, young and polished in a way that screamed ambition, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His tie was too tight, his smile too practiced. "Of course, Mrs. Sloane," he said, addressing me directly, though his eyes flicked to Caroline for approval. "We can go over the details as many times as needed." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached for the pen, my fingers steady, deliberate. Not to write, not yet, but to hold it, to feel its weight. It was cold, heavier than it looked, like a key to a door I hadn't yet opened. I turned it slowly in my hand, letting the silence stretch, letting Caroline's words echo in the room. She doesn't understand anything. Oh, but I did. I understood more than she could ever guess. Actually, I said, my voice low but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "I'd like to read the terms myself, Mr. Feldman, if that's all right." Caroline's head snapped toward me, her perfectly sculpted brows lifting in surprise. Her lipstick, a shade she called executive red, didn't move, but her smile faltered just for a moment. It was the kind of smile she wore at board meetings, the kind that closed deals and silenced objections. But I wasn't a client to be managed. Not today. Feldman blinked, caught off guard. "Of course, Mrs. Sloane," he said, recovering quickly. He slid a folder across the table, its edges crisp, its contents heavy with intent. "The draft is right here." Caroline exhaled sharply, a sound that carried more frustration than air. "Mom." She began, her tone coated in that false patience she used when she wanted to control the narrative. "I just think it would be easier if I summarized it for you. You know less. Overwhelming." Overwhelming. The word was a slap disguised as concern. I didn't look at her. I adjusted my glasses, the same wire-framed pair I'd worn for a decade, and leaned over the document. The words were stark black ink on cream paper, but they carried a weight far beyond their appearance. A living trust. My home, our home, the one Harold and I had built with sweat and dreams as the primary asset. Upon my death or declaration of mental incapacity, it would transfer to Caroline, bypassing probate, a clean, efficient transaction, a signature to erase a lifetime. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner, a soulless drone that matched the office's design. Heavy curtains muted light, a space crafted to make people sign without questioning. Caroline had chosen this place deliberately. She always chose her battlegrounds with care. Why is there a clause about mental incapacity? I asked, my voice calm, but pointed my eyes still on the page. Carolyn answered before Feldman could open his mouth. It's standard, Mom. Just in case you know if you ever get confused. She let the word hang unfinished, as if it were a kindness to leave the rest unsaid. I tilted my head, meeting her gaze for the first time. Her eyes were cold, calculating the eyes of someone who had already written my ending. Confused, I repeated, letting the word linger. And who decides when I'm confused? The silence that followed was sharp, like the moment before a storm breaks. Feldman cleared his throat, his fingers fidgeting with his pen. It's a common clause in living trusts, he said, his voice measured. It ensures the beneficiary can act swiftly if the grantor is no longer able to manage the asset. I nodded, my gaze still locked on Caroline. And who decides I'm no longer able? I asked again, slower this time, each word a stone dropped into still water. Caroline shifted in her chair, her smile tightening. Well, she began, her voice too smooth, too rehearsed. The trust designates me as the agent, so I'd work with a physician to have me declared incompetent. I finished for her, my tone as steady as the pen in my hand. Is that right? Mom? Don't be dramatic, she said, her laugh thin, nervous, the kind she used when she wanted to dismiss but not engage. It's just a precaution. A precaution. I closed the folder gently, the sound soft but final. I looked at her, really looked, her flawless forehead untouched by time or doubt, her watch expensive and impersonal glinting under the chandelier, her nails painted in a shade she called bone, a color as lifeless as her intentions. All the signs of someone who had come to collect, not to care. You do know I built that house with your father, I said, my voice low, almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of decades. We poured the foundation ourselves, slept in the basement on a mattress, no air conditioning, just open windows and mosquito bites. You were 6 when we planted the lilacs out front. You cried when we cut the root of that old rose bush, said it felt like killing something. Her face tightened, just a fraction, but enough for me to see. She didn't remember, or she didn't want to. I know, Mom, she said, her tone polite, distant. You've told me. But I wasn't telling her now. I was reminding myself. The house wasn't just wood and plaster. It was Harold's laugh echoing in the kitchen, the creak of the porch steps under our weight, the lilacs that bloomed every spring despite neglect. It was the life I'd built, the life she wanted to reduce to a signature. Caroline laughed again, that empty, practiced sound. Oh, Mom, don't make this emotional. It's a legal formality. You'll still live there, of course. Until you decide I'm confused. I said, my voice steady, my eyes unyielding. Feldman shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. Mrs. Sloane, he said, if you'd like, we can review an alternate draft. One without the incapacity clause. I can print it now. Caroline leaned forward, her voice still even, but laced with irritation. Mom, you're not thinking this through. You've always said you wanted me to have the house. This is just to avoid taxes and paperwork later. Yes, I said, my gaze returning to the folder. But I don't recall saying you should have it while I'm still breathing. She flinched just for a moment, then recovered her smile, snapping back into place like a mask. But I saw it, the crack in her armor, the flicker of doubt. I turned to Feldman. Please print the alternate draft. He nodded, rising quickly as if grateful for an excuse to leave the room. Caroline opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand, silencing her. You may be used to clients who nod and smile and do what they're told, I said. I'm not one of them. The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken truths. I leaned back in my chair, the pen still in my hand, its weight now a promise rather than a challenge. Caroline stared at me, her eyes searching for the mother she thought she knew, the one who baked scones, who nodded at her stories, who let things slide. That mother was gone, or perhaps she'd never existed. I was Miriam Sloane, and I was awake. As Feldman returned with the new draft, I felt something stir inside me, something old and fierce, like a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. The alternate draft was simpler, cleaner, without the clause that dangled like a noose over my future. I read every line, not because I didn't trust Feldman, but because I needed to feel the words to know they were mine. Caroline sat stiffly, her fingers gripping her portfolio, her silence louder than her words had been. I signed the new draft slowly, deliberately, my cursive as steady as it had been 50 years ago when I signed my marriage certificate. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the only sound in the room, a quiet rebellion against the narrative Caroline had tried to write for me. I handed the folder back to Feldman, who nodded, his eyes betraying a flicker of respect. Thank you, Mr. Feldman, I said, rising from my chair. I turned to Caroline, who was still frozen, her smile gone. As for you, we'll talk, but not here, not like this. I walked out first, my steps measured my head high. The silence in the hallway was heavier than the one I'd left behind, but it was mine. I didn't look back. Outside, the world was sharp and cold, the September air carrying a hint of something older, something that whispered of secrets buried in the earth. I stood by my car, a modest sedan that had outlived Harold by a decade, and let the wind tug at my scarf. My hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving as I replayed Caroline's words in my mind. She doesn't understand anything. They stung not because they were true, but because they revealed how little she understood me. I drove home slowly, the familiar streets blurring into a tapestry of memory. The house waited for me, pale yellow siding faded by time shutters in need of paint, lilacs standing guard like sentinels. It wasn't just a house. It was a vault of stories, a map of a life I'd fought to build, and yet there was something else here, something I hadn't noticed before. A shadow, faint but persistent, that clung to the edges of my vision, a whisper of something hidden, something Caroline didn't know she'd stirred. As I stepped inside, the air was still heavy with the scent of cinnamon from the scones I'd baked the night before. I hadn't eaten them. I rarely ate sweets anymore, but the ritual of baking kept the house alive, kept me tethered to something real. I stood in the doorway, my shoes still on, and listened. The house was quiet, but not empty. There was a hum, faint and low, like the pulse of something waiting to be uncovered. I moved to the living room, where Harold's chair creaked under my weight. It was an old thing, worn but sturdy, the kind of chair that held memories in its grain. I closed my eyes, letting the silence settle around me. But it wasn't silent, not really. There was a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingers on glass. I opened my eyes, my heart quickening. The room was empty, the curtains still. Yet the sound persisted, faint but insistent, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I stood my knees protesting and followed the noise. It led me to the hallway, to the secretary desk Harold had called my fortress. The drawer was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it that morning. Inside, among the envelopes and deeds, was something I hadn't seen in years. A small black notebook, its leather cover cracked with age. I hadn't touched it since Harold's death, since the days when I'd scribbled fragments of thoughts, dreams, fears. I opened it, my fingers trembling not from age, but from something else, something alive. The first page was blank, save for a single line in Harold's handwriting written in the faded ink of a fountain pen. The house keeps its secrets, Miriam, but they're yours to find. I froze, my breath catching. Harold had never mentioned this notebook, never hinted at secrets beyond the life we'd shared. Yet here it was, his words, staring back at me, a message from a man who'd been gone for 12 years. The tapping sound stopped, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. I turned the page, expecting more, but found only empty sheets. No clues, no explanations, just his words and the weight of something unspoken. I closed the notebook, my mind racing. Caroline's words echoed again. She doesn't understand anything, but they were drowned out by a new question, one that burned brighter with each passing second. What had Harold hidden, and why was it calling to me now? I sat at the dining room table, the notebook before me, its presence both a comfort and a challenge. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now, charged with possibility. I thought of Caroline, of her calculated smile, her assumption that I was a relic to be managed. She didn't know me, not really. She didn't know the woman who'd poured concrete with her husband under a blistering sun, who'd planted lilacs with a 6-year-old girl who cried over a rose bush. And she didn't know about the secrets Harold had left behind, secrets I was only beginning to sense. I picked up a pen, not the one from the lawyer's office, but one from the desk, its ink a deep blue that reminded me of Harold's eyes. I opened the notebook to the first blank page and wrote in my careful cursive, "People think age makes you weak, but I've never felt clearer." The words felt like a vow, a line drawn in the sand. Caroline thought she could erase me, but she'd underestimated me. And now, with Harold's cryptic message in my hands, I realized there was more at stake than a house or a trust. There was a truth buried here in the walls, in the earth, in the life I'd built. And I would find it. I stood, the notebook clutched to my chest, and looked out at the lilacs swaying in the evening breeze. The house was mine, but it was more than that. It was a puzzle, a legacy, a secret waiting to be unraveled. Caroline had tried to claim my future, but she didn't know the half of it. I wasn't just fighting for my home. I was fighting for my story. And I was just beginning. The house was alive that night, or so it seemed. The lilacs outside swayed in a wind. I couldn't feel their shadows dancing across the living room walls like ghosts whispering secrets. I sat at the dining room table, the black notebook open before me, Harold's cryptic message staring back. The house keeps its secrets, Miriam, but they're yours to find. The words were a spark igniting something deep within me, a hunger to uncover what he'd left behind, a defiance against the narrative Caroline was trying to write over my life. I hadn't slept well since the lawyer's office. Caroline's voice echoed in my mind, sharp and dismissive. She doesn't understand anything anymore. It wasn't just her words that stung, it was the certainty behind them, the assumption that I was a relic to be catalogued, a signature to be collected. But the notebook, with its single line in Harold's faded ink, was a reminder that I was more than her story. There was something hidden here in this house, in the life we'd built, and I would not let Caroline erase it. The morning after my confrontation at Feldman's office, I woke to a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I made tea, the same chipped mug with the floral rim, and stood at the kitchen window watching the backyard. The grass was too high, untamed, like the thoughts spiraling in my head, an I'd meant to call the neighborhood boy to mow it, but he hadn't come by this season. They disappear, don't they? The helpers, the check-ins, the small gestures of care. You become part of the background, a quiet house with drawn curtains, a name on a Christmas card no one opens. I returned to the notebook, flipping through its empty pages, searching for something, anything that might explain Harold's message. The leather cover was worn, its edges frayed, but it carried a weight that went beyond its physical form. I ran my fingers over the binding, half expecting it to pulse like a living thing. Just silence. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, waiting for me to act. The phone rang, shattering the quiet. I glanced at the caller ID, Caroline. I let it ring, each chime a small act of rebellion. She didn't leave a voicemail. Of course not. Caroline preferred conversations she could control, words she could edit. I turned back to the notebook, my resolve hardening. If she thought she could manage me with a trust document and a physician's signature, she was about to learn how wrong she was. I drove back to Feldman's office that afternoon, the notebook tucked into my purse, its presence a quiet companion. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The office was the same polished, soulless, designed to make people sign things without questioning. But this time, I wasn't here to be managed. I was here to unravel. Feldman greeted me with a cautious smile, his tie a shade looser than before, as if he sensed the shift in the air. "Mrs. Sloane," he said, gesturing to the same high-backed chair. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." "I wasn't expecting a lot of things," I replied, settling into the seat. "But here we are." He nodded, his eyes flicking to the folder on his desk, the alternate draft. I'd signed the one without the clause that would have handed my life to Caroline on a silver platter. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss?" he asked, his voice careful as if stepping around broken glass. I leaned forward, my hands folded, my gaze steady. "The trust document," I said. "I want to understand every word, and I want to know what else is in play." Feldman blinked, caught off guard. "In play." "Don't play coy, Mr. Feldman," I said, my voice low but sharp. "My daughter didn't draft that incapacity clause on her own. Someone advised her. Someone planted the idea that I'm a step away from being declared unfit. I want to know who." "Oh." He shifted his fingers, brushing the edge of the folder. "Mrs. Sloane, I assure you the clause was standard. It's included in most living trusts to protect whom I interrupted, my tone cutting through his practiced calm. "Me. Or the person who stands to gain when I'm pushed out of my own life." The room stilled, the air thick with unspoken truths. Feldman's smile faltered, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes, guilt perhaps, or recognition. "I understand your concern," he said finally, "but I can assure you no one is trying to undermine you." The clause was a precaution, nothing more. A precaution, I repeated, letting the word hang like a blade. Then why does it feel like a trap? He didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, I felt the weight of something larger, something hidden. Caroline wasn't acting alone. She never did. She was too careful, too calculated to risk a move this bold without guidance. Someone, Feldman, perhaps, or someone higher up, had whispered in her ear, planting the seeds of control. I leaned back, studying him. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight, a telltale sign of someone holding back. "Tell me, Mr. Feldman," I said, my voice softer now, almost conspiratorial, "what else is in that trust? What's buried in the fine print that I haven't seen?" He hesitated, then opened the folder, his fingers moving with deliberate care. "The trust is straightforward," he said, sliding a copy toward me. Your home is the primary asset. Upon your passing, or in the event of incapacity, it transfers to Caroline bypassing probate. There are no hidden clauses. I took the document, my eyes scanning the pages. The words were clinical precise, but they carried a shadow I couldn't quite name. And if I change my mind, I asked. If I decide to rewrite the terms entirely, Feldman's eyes widened just a fraction. You're within your rights to amend the trust, he said, but it would require a new draft notarized, and, well, it might complicate things with your daughter. Complicate things. I echoed, a smile tugging at my lips. Good. Let's complicate things. I spent the next hour dissecting the document line by line with Feldman's reluctant assistance. Each clause was a thread in a tapestry I hadn't realized I was weaving. The trust was meant to protect my home, my legacy, but it was also a chain binding me to Caroline's vision of my future, a future where I was quiet, compliant, gone. I thought of Harold's notebook, his words a beacon in the fog. The house keeps its secrets. What had he meant? Was the house itself the secret, or was there something more? Something buried in the walls, the foundation, the earth beneath? As Feldman explained the legalities, I let my mind wander back to the house. The lilacs, the creaking porch, steps, the basement where we'd slept on a mattress under a single blanket. I remembered the night Harold had come home late, his hands smudged with dirt, his eyes bright with something he wouldn't share. Just fixing something out back, he'd said, brushing off my questions. I'd thought nothing of it then, but now with the notebook in my purse, I wondered, what had he been fixing? What had he hidden? Mrs. Sloane, Feldman's voice pulled me back. Are you all right? I nodded, setting the document down. I want a new draft, I said, one that names my granddaughter Sarah as the beneficiary. No incapacity clause, no loopholes, just her. Feldman's pen froze mid-air. Sarah, he repeated, as if testing the name. That's a significant change. It's my change, I set my voice steady, and I want it done today. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine as if looking for a crack in my resolve. He found none. I'll need to prepare the paperwork, he said finally. It'll take a few hours. Then I'll wait, I said, leaning back in my chair. I've waited 72 years. A few hours won't kill me. While Feldman worked, I stepped outside the notebook, still in my purse, its weight a constant reminder. The sky had darkened clouds rolling in like a warning. I walked to a small bench near the office, the kind meant for decoration, rather than comfort, and sat letting the wind tug at my scarf. My thoughts drifted to Caroline, to the girl she'd been, small hands braiding my hair, chattering about Nancy Drew and smart girls with flashlights. Where had that girl gone? When had she become this woman who saw me as a liability, a box to be checked? I opened the notebook again, hoping for answers, but the pages remained stubbornly blank. I traced Harold's words with my finger, the ink faint but indelible. The house keeps its secrets. The phrase was a riddle, a challenge, and I felt a thrill I hadn't known in years. There was power in not knowing, in the act of seeking. Caroline thought she could control me, but she didn't know about the notebook, about the fire it had sparked. She didn't know about the woman I was becoming. My phone buzzed in my purse. Caroline's name flashing again. I ignored it, letting it go to voicemail. She'd try again, I knew. She always did when she sensed resistance. But this time, I wasn't resisting. I was reclaiming. Back in the office, Feldman presented the new draft, its pages crisp and heavy with intent. I read every word, my glasses slipping slightly as I leaned over the table. The trust now named Sarah as the sole beneficiary, with no mention of incapacity, no room for Caroline's maneuvering. It was clean, precise, a declaration of my will. Are you sure about this? Feldman asked, his voice soft, almost paternal. This will change things. I'm counting on it, I said, picking up the pen. My hand didn't shake as I signed the scratch of ink against paper, a sound of victory. I handed the document back to Feldman, who looked at me with something like awe. You're a rare woman, Mrs. Sloane, he said, his smile genuine for the first time. Not many would do this. I'm not many, I replied, rising from my chair. I'm me. As I left the office, the notebook pressed against my side. I felt a shift like the earth tilting beneath my feet. The trust was a start, but it wasn't the end. There was something more, something Harold had left for me to find. And I would find it not just to spite Caroline, but to honor the life we'd built, the secrets we'd kept. That evening, I returned to the house, the lilacs glowing under the moonlight. I stood on the porch listening to the creak of the steps, the same sound that had greeted me for decades. But tonight, it felt different, like a signal. I opened the notebook again, hoping for a clue, a sign. The pages were still blank, but as I turned them, something fell out, a small, folded piece of paper yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully, my heart pounding. It was a map, hand-drawn, its lines faint but precise. A sketch of our backyard, the lilacs marked with an X, and a single word in Harold's handwriting. Dig. My breath caught, the world narrowing to that single word. Dig. What had he buried? What had he hidden all those years ago under the guise of fixing something? I looked out at the backyard, the grass silver in the moonlight, the lilacs swaying like guardians. The house was alive, and it was speaking to me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, the map spread before me, the notebook open to Harold's message. Caroline's voice still lingered. She doesn't understand anything, but it was drowned out by a louder truth. I understood more than she could ever imagine. The house held secrets, and they were mine to uncover. Caroline wanted control, but she didn't know the game she'd started. I was no longer just a mother, a grandmother, a widow. I was a woman with a map, a mission, and a fire that refused to be extinguished. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It never was. The walls held echoes of laughter, of arguments, of nights when Harold and I sat in the dark, planning a future we thought would last forever. Now, as I stood in the kitchen, the chipped floral mug steaming in my hands, I felt the weight of those memories pressing against me like a tide pulling at the shore. The lilacs outside swayed in the wind, their shadows clawing at the window, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell me something. The map I'd found in Harold's notebook, the one with the single word, dig, lay on the table, its edges curling like a secret unwilling to stay hidden. I'd come home from Feldman's office with a fire in my chest, a fire Caroline had unknowingly lit when she said I didn't understand anything. Her words were a blade, but they'd cut away something I hadn't realized was there, a veil of compliance, a habit of silence I'd worn like a second skin. I was awake now, and the house seemed to know it. The creak of the floorboards felt deliberate, the hum of the refrigerator a low, conspiratorial murmur. I was no longer just Miriam Sloane, widow, mother, grandmother. I was a woman with a map, a mission, and a truth to uncover. I sat at the dining room table, the notebook open before me, the map beside it. The X marked under the lilacs was precise, drawn with the steady hand of a man who'd always been careful with his secrets. Harold had never been one for theatrics, but he'd had a way of leaving things unsaid, letting them simmer until the right moment. What had he buried? A letter, a keepsake, something more? The question gnawed at me, sharp and insistent like a splinter under the skin. I traced the X with my finger, my mind drifting to Caroline. Her voice in the lawyer's office still echoed. We'll just explain it all to her again, slowly. It wasn't just disrespect, it was erasure. She'd stopped seeing me as a person, reduced me to a task on her endless list. And she wasn't alone. The neighbors who nodded politely, but never stopped to talk the cashier at the corner store, who barely looked up from his phone, they all saw me as a shadow, a figure fading into the background. You get to a certain age, and the world starts talking around you, deciding for you until one day you realize they think you're already half gone. I stood the mug cooling in my hands and walked to the living room. Harold's chair creaked as I sat, its familiar groan a comfort. I closed my eyes, letting the memories flood in. The summer we'd built this house, Harold shirtless and grinning, his hands calloused from mixing concrete. The night Caroline, barely 6, had helped me plant the lilacs, her small fingers caked with dirt, her eyes wide with wonder. Will they grow forever, Mama, she'd asked. I'd said yes because back then I believed in forever. Now, those lilacs were the only thing that hadn't changed standing guard outside, while Caroline tried to sign away my life. The tapping started again, faint but unmistakable, like a finger on glass. I opened my eyes, my heart quickening. The room was empty, the curtains still, but the sound was there, coming from the hallway. I followed it, my steps slow, deliberate, as if the house itself was guiding me. The noise led me back to the secretary desk, to the drawer I'd found the notebook in. It was closed, but when I opened it, a single sheet of paper lay on top, one I hadn't seen before. It was folded, its edges brittle, and written in Harold's handwriting was a single line. "The truth is deeper than the roots." My breath caught my fingers trembling as I unfolded the paper. It was another sketch, not a map this time, but a diagram of the house, our house. The basement was circled with an arrow pointing to a corner I hadn't thought about in years, a corner we'd sealed off after a flood in '78. Below the diagram, Harold had written, "For Miriam when you're ready." Ready for what? The question burned, but there was no answer, only the weight of the paper in my hands, the weight of a secret I hadn't known I was carrying. I looked around the room, half expecting Harold to step out of the shadows, his lopsided grin explaining everything. But he was gone, and I was alone with his riddles, with a house that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I didn't go to the basement that night. Not yet. The idea of digging, of breaking open the earth or the walls, felt too final, too much like crossing a threshold I wasn't ready for. Instead, I carried the notebook and the new sketch to the living room, placing them on the mantel beside 3 photographs, one of Harold and me at our 50th anniversary. His arm around my waist, both of us laughing. One of Caroline, in her graduation gown, her smile as polished as her future, and one of Sarah, my granddaughter, as a child, holding a watering can twice her size, grinning at the tulips. Sarah, the only one who still saw me. I thought of her now, of the way she'd breeze into the house without warning, her boots clattering on the porch, her voice filling the silence. She'd stopped by just last week, bringing coffee and a lemon cake that tasted like summer. She'd talked too fast as always, her hands flying as she updated me on her coursework, her part-time job, her dreams of studying abroad. She hadn't stayed long, but she'd kissed my cheek on the way out and said, "Love you, Grandma." "Don't let Mom drive you nuts," I'd chuckled, but her words had lingered, a reminder that she saw what Carolyn didn't. The phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. It wasn't Caroline this time, but Sarah. I answered, my voice softer than I meant it to be. "Hello, sweetheart." "Grandma." Her voice was bright, breathless, like she'd been running. "I'm coming over. Got coffee and those scones you like, the real lemon ones, not the fake stuff." "You home?" I smiled, the warmth of her voice cutting through the chill of the house. "I'm here. Always am." "Good," she said. "Be there in 10." I hung up my eyes, drifting back to the photographs. Sarah was different. She didn't treat me like a task, a relic, a problem to be solved. She asked how I slept, noticed when my coat was buttoned wrong, helped me change a light bulb without making it a performance. She was Harold's stubbornness, my curiosity wrapped in a messy bun, and a smile that didn't demand anything in return. When Sarah arrived, the house seemed to exhale as if it had been waiting for her. She burst through the door, her boots leaving faint smudges on the floor, a to-go tray with 2 lattes in her hands. Her hair was pulled back, strands escaping like they always did, and her cheeks were pink from the wind. "You look good," she said, setting the tray on the table. "Like you just told someone off." I raised an eyebrow, settling into Harold's chair. "I did." "Your mother," she snorted, kicking off her boots and flopping onto the couch. "Excellent. Spill." I hesitated, not because I didn't trust her, but because the weight of it all, Caroline's betrayal, Harold's secrets. The map was heavier than I had expected. I sipped my coffee, the warmth grounding me, and told her about the lawyer's office, about Caroline's words, about the trust and the incapacity clause. I didn't mention the notebook or the map. Not yet. Those were mine, at least, until I understood them. Sarah listened, her eyes narrowing. As I spoke, her hands still for once. When I finished, she leaned forward, her voice low. "That's disgusting. She tried to write you out of your own life." "It's legal," I said, echoing Feldman's words. "That's what makes it worse." She reached for my hand, her fingers warm, real. "What are you going to do?" I looked at her, at the earnestness in her eyes, the way she leaned in, waiting for my answer. "I'm going to change everything I said," the words slipping out before I could stop them. They felt like a vow, a promise to myself, to Harold, to the house. Her eyes widened, a grin spreading across her face. God, I wish I'd been there to see her face. I smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. She doesn't remember who I am, Sarah. Not really. She sees a house, a signature, a problem to be solved. But I'm not a problem. I'm her mother. Sarah's grin faded, replaced by something softer. Something that reminded me of Harold when he listened, really listened. "You're more than that," she said. "You're Grandma. You're the one who taught me how to plant tulips, who told me stories about Grandpa fixing things he broke just to make you laugh. You're not invisible to me." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of the loneliness that had been creeping in. I squeezed her hand, my throat tight. "You're a good girl, Sarah. You always have been." She snorted again, pulling a scone from the paper bag she'd brought. "I'm just decent. These days, that's rare enough." She took a bite, groaning theatrically. "So what's next? You signed the new trust, right? Named me instead of Mom." I nodded, watching her eat the way she chewed with the same unself-conscious soy Harold had. I did. But it's not about the house, not really. It's about making sure the right person carries it forward. She stopped, chewing, her eyes meeting mine. "You mean me. I mean you." I said, my voice steady. "Because you knock before you enter. Because you listen." She swallowed, her eyes shining. "Grandma, it's a lot. It's not a reward," I said gently. "It's a trust. There's a difference." We sat in silence after that, not the heavy kind that presses down, but the kind that holds space for truth. The house was quiet again, but the tapping had stopped, as if it, too, was listening. I glanced at the notebook on the mantel, the map hidden inside. Sarah didn't know about it, and I wasn't ready to tell her. Not until I understood what Harold had left behind, what he'd meant for me to find. After Sarah left the house, settled back into its stillness, but it was different now, charged with possibility. I carried the notebook to the basement door, my hand hovering over the knob. The diagram Harold had drawn, the circled corner, the arrow burned in my mind. I hadn't been down there in years, not since the flood that had forced us to seal off part of the space. The door was heavy, its paint chipped, and when I opened it, a gust of cool, damp air hit me, carrying the scent of earth and memory. I flicked on the light, a single bulb flickering to life, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The basement was a time capsule boxes of old clothes, a broken chair Harold had sworn he'd fix a stack of Caroline's childhood drawings. I moved to the corner Harold had marked where a patch of concrete looked newer, smoother than the rest. I knelt, my knees protesting, and ran my fingers over the surface. It was cold, unyielding, but there was a faint seam barely visible, as if someone had poured fresh concrete to cover something beneath. I stood, my heart pounding. Dig. The word echoed not just from the map, but from somewhere deeper, as if the house itself was whispering it. I didn't have a shovel, not yet, but I didn't need one to know that something was waiting for me here, something Harold had buried not just in the ground, but in the story of our life. I returned upstairs, the notebook clutched to my chest, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the lilacs. The X on the map was out there too, under the roots, under the earth. 2 secrets, 2 hiding places. What was Harold trying to tell me? Was it a warning, a gift, a confession? The questions swirled, but they didn't frighten me. They fueled me. That night, I dreamed of Harold. He was standing in the backyard, his hands dirty, his eyes bright with that secret spark I'd seen so many times. "Your clothes, Miriam," he said, his voice clear as if he were in the room. "But you have to dig deeper." I woke with a start. The room dark, the house silent. The notebook was on my bedside table, its presence a challenge I couldn't ignore. I didn't know what I'd find under the lilacs in the basement in the pages of the notebook. But I knew this Caroline thought she could control my future, but she didn't know the past. She didn't know the man who'd built this house with me, who'd left me clues in the dark. She didn't know the woman I was becoming, the one who was no longer content to be invisible. I picked up the notebook, opened it to a blank page, and wrote, "I'm not done yet." And neither is this house. The words felt like a spell, a binding of my will to the walls around me. Caroline could try to erase me, but I was rooted here deeper than she could ever understand. And I would dig until I found the truth. The morning light slipped through the kitchen curtains, soft and pale, but it did little to warm the chill that had settled in my bones. The house was awake, its creaks and sighs louder than usual, as if it knew what I was about to do. On the dining room table, the black notebook lay open, Harold's cryptic words staring up at me. "The house keeps its secrets. Miriam. But they're yours to find." Beside it was the map, the X under the lilacs burning like a brand, and the diagram of the basement, its circled corner, a silent command, dig. The truth is deeper than the roots he'd written. I was ready to find out how deep. Caroline's voice still haunted me. She doesn't understand anything anymore, but it was no longer a wound. It was fuel. She thought she could erase me, reduce me to a signature on a trust document, a name to be crossed off her list. But she didn't know about the notebook, the map, the secrets Harold had left for me. She didn't know the woman I was becoming, the one who was done being invisible. I stood, my knees protesting, as I moved to the secretary desk in the hallway, Harold's fortress, as he'd called it. The drawer held more than just the notebook now. There were envelopes, statements, the deed to the house insurance papers. Everything Caroline had tried to control without my knowledge. I pulled them out, spreading them across the table like pieces of a puzzle. Among them, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a small, sealed envelope tucked beneath the deed, addressed to me in Harold's handwriting. My heart quickened as I opened it, expecting another clue, another piece of the mystery. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once, with a message that stopped my breath. Miriam, if you're reading this, you've already started. Don't let them take what's ours. The key is in the earth. The key. Not a metaphor, but something tangible, something buried. I looked at the map again, the X under the lilacs, and felt a surge of certainty. Whatever Harold had hidden, it was more than a memory. It was power, and it was mine to claim. I picked up a pen, the same blue-inked one I'd used to write in the notebook, and began a list. Not just any list, but a plan, a declaration of war against Caroline's control, call Feldman, request revised trust documents, review house deed, list all monthly transfers to Caroline and her family, call the bank, block automatic payments, schedule meeting with financial advisor, write letter to Sarah. I underlined Sarah's name twice, the ink bold and deliberate. She was the only one who saw me, the only one who deserved to carry forward what I'd built. The list was my anchor, my map in a different sense. Each item was a step toward reclaiming my life, my story, my secrets. I wasn't just fighting for a house or a trust. I was fighting for the right to be seen, to be heard, to be Miriam Sloane. The bank was my first stop, a sterile building that smelled of disinfectant and bureaucracy. The clerk behind the counter was young, her nails glossy, her eyes glued to a screen. I gave her my name, my ID, and a smile I'd practiced in the mirror, one that said I was calm but unyielding. She typed something, her fingers quick, then frowned. "You're here about the automatic transfers. I'm here to stop them." I corrected my voice steady. "All of them." She blinked, glancing at the screen again. "There are quite a few on record. We'd need a manager to authorize a full suspension." "Then fetch one, dear," I said, my smile unwavering. "I'll wait." She hesitated, then disappeared down a hallway, her heels clicking like a metronome. I stood at the counter, my purse heavy with the notebook and Harold's letter. The bank was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of paper. I felt eyes on me, not the clerk's, but someone else's, a shadow in my peripheral vision. I turned, but no one was there, just rows of empty chairs and a trembling fern in the corner. The house wasn't the only place that felt alive today. A man appeared tall and balding with the weary politeness of someone used to diffusing complaints. "Mrs. Sloane," he said, introducing himself as Andrew. "I understand you want to terminate all automatic payments." "Permanently," I clarified, following him to a private room. The space was small, clinical, with a single monitor and that same trembling fern, its leaves curling inward like it was tired of trying. I sat my hands, folded the notebook in my purse, a quiet reminder of why I was here. Andrew pulled up a list on the screen, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "We're talking about monthly transfers to your daughter's household," he said. "Utilities, tuitions support a few lifestyle expenses. Lavish lifestyle expenses," I said, my tone sharp but calm. "Spa memberships, vacation savings, dry cleaning subscriptions." I counted 17 charges that weren't even hers. He cleared his throat, his eyes flickering to the screen. "Would you like to explain the reason?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "Just end them." He nodded, typing quickly, but I saw the hesitation in his movements, the way his fingers paused over the keys. "There's a shared family fund," he said, glancing at me. $200 monthly. And a wellness account for Sarah Sloane. $250. I raised an eyebrow. A wellness account, I didn't authorize that. He turned the monitor toward me, showing a list of transactions. The family fund I knew about Caroline had convinced me it was for emergencies, though I'd never seen proof. But the wellness account for Sarah was new. A quiet addition slipped in without my knowledge. Clever Caroline. Always thorough. Delete them all, I said, my voice like steel. And I want to open a new account. Trust-based beneficiary, Sarah Sloan. Conditions locked until age 30, or upon demonstration of financial hardship with written request. 2 co-signers, my lawyer, and myself. Andrew didn't flinch, but his eyes widened slightly. Of course, he said, typing again. This will take some time. I have time, I said, leaning back in the chair. I'm not going anywhere. As he worked, I stared at the fern, its browned tip a mirror to my own weariness. Caroline hadn't just taken help. She'd automated the taking, turning my generosity into a machine that fed her life while starving mine. But the notebook, the map, the letter, they were my rebellion, my proof that I was more than her calculations. When Andrew finished, he printed 3 sets of confirmations, the paper crisp and final. Would you like to notify the recipients yourself? He asked. No, I said, signing the forms with a steady hand. Let silence do the work. He nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Not many people take this kind of step, he said as he walked me out. It takes clarity. No, I corrected, stepping into the sunlight. It takes being ignored one too many times. Back at the house, the lilacs glowed under the afternoon sun, their petals trembling as if they knew what was coming. I stood in the backyard, the map in my hand, the X staring up at me. Dig. The word was a command, a challenge, a promise. I didn't have a shovel, but I had a trowel, small and rusted, tucked away in the shed. It would do for now. I knelt under the lilacs, the earth cool and damp beneath my fingers. The roots were thick, tangled like veins running deep into the ground. I dug carefully, the trowel scraping against dirt and stone, my heart pounding with each scoop. What was I looking for? A box, a letter, a key as. Harold's note had promised. The earth resisted, clinging to its secrets, but I was relentless, driven by a fire I hadn't felt in years. After 20 minutes, the trowel hit something hard, a dull thud that echoed in my chest. I brushed away the dirt, my fingers trembling, and uncovered a small metal box, its surface pitted with rust but intact. My breath caught as I lifted it, its weight heavier than I had expected. It was locked, a tiny keyhole, staring up at me like an unblinking eye. I sat back on my heels, the box in my lap, the lilacs swaying above me. The key is in the earth, Harold had written. But there was no key here, only the box, its contents, a mystery I couldn't yet unlock. I carried it inside, placing it on the kitchen table beside the notebook and the map. The house was silent, but it felt alive, its walls watching, waiting. I tried the basement, next driven by the diagram Harold had left. The corner he'd marked was still there, the concrete smoother than the rest, a faint seam betraying its secret. I didn't have the tools to break it open, not yet, but I ran my fingers over the surface, feeling for a clue, a crack, anything, nothing, just cold, unyielding stone. I stood, my knees aching, and whispered to the empty room. What are you hiding? Harold. The house didn't answer, but I felt it listening. That evening, I sat at the dining room table, the box and the notebook before me, and wrote the letter to Sarah. It wasn't long, but it was deliberate, each word chosen with care. I didn't tell her about the box or the map, not yet. Those were mine at least until I understood them. Instead, I wrote about her, about the way she saw me, about the trust I'd placed in her. Sarah, I wrote, I never wanted Manin to make you choose, and I don't expect you to defend me. What I'm doing isn't about dividing the family. It's about drawing a line where none existed. You see me not as a task or a relic, but as a person. That's why the future is yours. Not as a reward, but as a reminder, never let anyone make you invisible. I folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it beside the notebook. The house was quiet, but the silence was different now, charged with purpose. I'd taken the first steps, canceled the transfers, rewritten the trust, found the box. But there was more to do, more to uncover. The key was out there somewhere, and with it, the truth Harold had buried. The next morning, I called Feldman, my voice steady as I requested a meeting to finalize the new trust documents. He sounded surprised, but agreed scheduling me for the afternoon. As I hung up the phone, buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Mom, we need to talk. This isn't the way." I didn't reply. She'd learned soon enough that I wasn't speaking her language anymore. I drove to the law office, the metal box in my purse beside the notebook, its weight a constant reminder. Feldman greeted me with the same cautious smile, but there was something new in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or unease. "Mrs. Sloane," he said, gesturing to the private room. "The documents are ready." I sat reading every line of the new trust, ensuring Sarah's name was there unassailable. Feldman watched me, his fingers tapping the desk. "You're thorough," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "I have to be," I replied, signing the final page. "People like to rewrite my story when I'm not looking." He nodded, but his eyes flickered to my purse as if he sensed the weight of what I carried. "Is there anything else I can help with?" he asked. I hesitated, then pulled out the metal box, placing it on the table. "This," I said. "It's locked, and I don't have the key. Can you open it?" Feldman's brows lifted, but he took the box, turning it over in his hands. "It's old," he said. "We'd need a locksmith. But may I ask where you found it?" "In the earth," I said, echoing Harold's words. "Where the truth is." He looked at me, his expression unreadable, then nodded. "I'll make some calls." As I left the office, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. I drove home the box back in my purse, its mystery intact. The house greeted me with its familiar creaks, its lilacs swaying like sentinels. I stood in the backyard staring at the spot where I'd dug the earth still disturbed a wound that hadn't yet healed. Caroline could try to control me, but she didn't know about the box, the map, the key I hadn't yet found. She didn't know the strength I'd discovered, the fire Harold had left for me to ignite. I was no longer just fighting for my home. I was fighting for my truth, and I would not stop until it was mine. The house was restless tonight, its walls humming with a quiet urgency, as if it knew what I was planning. The metal box sat on the kitchen table, its locked surface glinting under the chandelier's soft glow, a silent challenge I hadn't yet answered. Beside it, Harold's notebook lay open, the map with the X under the lilacs, and the basement diagrams staring up at me, their secrets still out of reach. "The key is in the earth," Harold had written, but the earth had given me only the box, not the key. I felt the weight of his words of the truth buried deeper than roots, and I knew that tonight at Caroline's carefully curated gala, I would unearth something else entirely my own voice. It was Marlene, my neighbor, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, who had let the secret slip. She'd stopped by that morning, her basket of zucchini a pretext for gossip. "Big party at Caroline's tonight," she'd said, her voice dripping with feigned nonchalance. "Didn't she tell you? Half the town's invited, it seems." Her words were a blade, not because of her intent, but because of the truth they carried. I hadn't been invited. My own daughter, hosting a celebration in the shadow of my home, had left me out as if I were already a ghost. I stood in my bedroom now, the mirror reflecting a woman I was still learning to recognize. The dress I'd chosen was deep emerald, a relic from a life when Harold and I danced under starlight, its fabric clinging to my frame with a quiet elegance. I fastened the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 20th anniversary, their weight a reminder of the promises we'd kept. My hair, silver but still thick, fell in soft waves, and I pinned it back with a clip that caught the light. This wasn't vanity. This was armor. The invitation's absence was no accident. Caroline had planned this, a public declaration that I was no longer part of her world, a step toward the erasure she'd started in the lawyer's office. She doesn't understand anything anymore. Her words echoed, but they didn't wound me now. They fueled me. Tonight I would walk into her perfect party uninvited, not to beg for a place, but to remind her who I was. I slipped the metal box into a small velvet bag, tucking it into my purse alongside the notebook. I didn't know why I brought them, only that they felt like talismans, pieces of Harold's mystery that tethered me to my purpose. The map, the diagram, the locked box, they were more than clues. They were proof that I was still here, still fighting, still uncovering truths Caroline could never control. The drive to Caroline's house was short, but it felt like crossing a battlefield. Her neighborhood was polished, all manicured lawns and oversized mailboxes, a world where appearances were currency. The street was lined with cars sleek and expensive, their headlights slicing through the dusk. I parked at the end of the block, my modest sedan out of place among the polished SUVs. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of jasmine and anticipation. And as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt the house behind me, its presence a quiet encouragement. Caroline's home was ablaze with light, its windows glowing like a stage set for a performance. Music spilled out a polished jazz number that masked the tension I knew was waiting. I walked up the driveway, my heels clicking against the stone, each step a declaration. The door was ajar, a young man in a black vest checking names against a tablet. I didn't stop, didn't offer my name. I walked past him, my chin high, my purse clutched tight, and he didn't question me. Age has its advantages. People assume you belong somewhere, even if it's nowhere. The foyer was crowded, a sea of tailored suits and shimmering dresses, laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. I scanned the room, my eyes sharp despite the years. Caroline stood near the center, her red dress a beacon, her smile as calculated as her trust documents. She was holding court, her husband Philip at her side, his tie too tight, his grin too forced. Guests swirled around them, their voices a chorus of flattery. But I saw what they didn't, the way Caroline's eyes darted, searching for cracks in her perfect facade. I moved through the crowd, unnoticed at first, a shadow in a room of light. But then Sarah saw me. She was across the room, her hair loose, her dress a soft blue that caught the chandelier's glow. Her eyes widened, a grin spreading across her face as she pushed through the crowd toward me. "Grandma," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "What are you doing here?" I smiled, squeezing her hand. "I wasn't invited," I said, my voice low but steady. "But I came, anyway." Her grin widened, a spark of mischief in her eyes. "Oh, this is gonna be good." Before I could respond, Carolyn's head turned, her gaze locking onto mine. The room didn't stop, but it felt like it did, the air thickening, the music fading to a distant hum. Her smile froze, her lips parting slightly as she registered my presence. Philip followed her gaze, his expression shifting from confusion to unease. The guests around us continued their chatter, oblivious to the storm brewing in the space between us. Mom Caroline said, her voice smooth but strained as she approached. "What a surprise, is it?" I asked, my tone light but sharp, like a blade hidden in silk. I thought you'd expect me at a family celebration. Her eyes flickered to the crowd, then back to me, calculating. Of course, she said, her smile snapping back into place. I just assumed you'd be resting. Resting, I repeated, letting the word hang. Funny how you assume so much about me these days. Sarah snorted softly, her hand still in mine, a quiet ally in the storm. Caroline's smile tightened, but she gestured toward a corner of the room, away from the guests. Can we talk privately? She asked, her voice low, controlled. I nodded, following her to a small alcove near the staircase, Sarah trailing behind. The music was softer here, the chatter muted, but the tension was a living thing coiling around us. Philip hovered nearby, his hands in his pockets, his eyes darting between us. What are you doing here? Mom, Caroline asked, her voice dropping the pretense of warmth. This is a private event. Private, I said, my gaze steady. Yet half the town seems to be here. Everyone but me. She flinched just a fraction, but enough to tell me I'd struck a nerve. I didn't think you'd want to come, she said, her words careful, rehearsed. You've been tired lately. I was trying to spare you. Spare me, I said, my voice low, each word deliberate. Or spare yourself the trouble of explaining why you tried to write me out of my own life. Her eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through her composure. What are you talking about? The trust, I said, stepping closer, my voice a whisper now sharp enough to cut. The incapacity clause, the automatic transfers you didn't bother to mention, the way you've been talking around me, deciding for me, as if I'm already gone. The alcove was silent, the air heavy with the weight of truth. Philip shifted uncomfortably, his eyes on the floor, but Sarah stood firm, her hand brushing mine, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. Caroline opened her mouth, then closed it, her lips a thin line. You're blowing this out of proportion, she said finally, her voice tight. It's just paperwork. Paperwork, I said, my smile cold. That's what you call it when you try to declare your mother incompetent. The words landed like a slap, and for a moment, Caroline's mask slipped, revealing something raw, anger, fear, maybe even shame. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. I'm trying to protect you, to make things easier. Easier for who? I interrupted, my voice steady, unyielding. For you, for the life you've built on my dime, my home, my silence. The room beyond us seemed to fade. The guests' laughter a distant echo. Caroline's eyes darted to Sarah, then back to me, searching for an escape. This isn't the place, she said, her voice low, a warning. It's exactly the place, I said, stepping forward, my purse heavy with the box and the notebook. You wanted a stage, Caroline. You got one. I reached into my purse, pulling out the metal box, its surface dull in the dim light. The crowd hadn't noticed us yet, but Sarah's eyes widened, her breath catching. What's that? She whispered. Something your grandfather left me, I said, my voice calm, but carrying a weight that silenced Caroline's protest. Something you don't know about. Caroline's gaze locked onto the box, her composure cracking further. What are you doing? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Showing you I'm still here, I said, holding the box up, letting it catch the light. You thought you could erase me, Caroline. You thought you could decide my story. But this house, this life, these secrets, they're mine, and I'm not done with them. The alcove was a vacuum, the air sucked out by the force of my words. Sarah's hand tightened on mine, her eyes shining with something like pride. Philip stepped forward, his voice hesitant. Miriam, maybe we should. No, I cut him off, my gaze never leaving Caroline. You don't get to mediate. Not tonight. Caroline's face was a mask of controlled fury, but beneath it, I saw something else, fear. Not of me, but of what I represented, a truth she couldn't control, a story she couldn't rewrite. "You're making a scene," she said, her voice low, a final attempt to regain the upper hand. "Then let it be a scene." I said, my voice rising just enough to carry. "Let everyone see that Miriam Sloane is still here, still standing, still fighting for what's hers." The room beyond us began to quiet, heads turning, whispers spreading like ripples. I didn't care. I'd come to be seen, not to hide. I turned to Sarah, my voice softening. "Come with me, sweetheart. We're done here." She nodded, her grin fierce, and followed me as I walked back through the crowd, my head high, the box and notebook in my purse, a silent promise. The guests parted their eyes, curious, some confused, others amused. Caroline didn't follow, but I felt her gaze burning into my back, a heat I welcomed. As we stepped outside, the night air was cool, sharp, a balm against the fire in my chest. Sarah linked her arm through mine, her voice bright. "That was incredible, Grandma. You just walked in and owned it." I smiled, squeezing her arm. "I had to." She forgot who I was. Sarah laughed, the sound alight in the darkness. "She won't forget again." We drove back to my house in silence, the kind that holds space for truth rather than suffocating it. The lilacs greeted us, their shadows softer now, less restless. Inside, I placed the box on the table, its locked surface a mystery I was closer to solving. Sarah sat across from me, her eyes on the box, curiosity radiating from her. "What's in it?" she asked, her voice soft. "I don't know yet," I said, my fingers brushing the lid. "But I will." She nodded, her trust in me, a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "You're kind of a badass, Grandma," she said, grinning. I laughed, the sound surprising me. Maybe I am. As she left, promising to return the next day, I stood in the kitchen, the box and notebook before me. The house was quiet, but it was alive, its secrets pulsing just beneath the surface. Caroline had tried to erase me, but tonight I'd rewritten the story. And I wasn't done. The house was quieter than usual the morning after the party, as if it too was catching its breath after the storm I'd unleashed. The lilacs outside stood still, their shadows soft against the dawn, no longer restless but watchful like sentinels guarding a secret. On the kitchen table, the metal box sat unopened, its locked surface. A riddle I hadn't yet solved next to Harold's notebook with its cryptic messages. "The house keeps its secrets, Miriam, but they're yours to find, and the key is in the earth." The map with the X under the lilacs and the basement diagram lay beside them, their lines a silent promise of truths waiting to be uncovered. I hadn't found the key yet, but last night at Caroline's gala, I'd found something else, my voice sharp and unyielding, cutting through her carefully curated world. I stood at the kitchen window, my chipped floral mug steaming with tea, and replayed the moment I'd walked into that party. The metal box, heavy in my purse, my emerald dress, a declaration of defiance. Caroline's face, her mask of control cracking under the weight of my presence, was a victory I hadn't anticipated. "You thought you could erase me," I'd said. And the words had felt like a spell, binding her to the truth she'd tried to bury. Sarah's hand in mine, her fierce grin had been my anchor, a reminder that I wasn't alone. But now, in the quiet of my home, I braced for the fallout. The phone buzzed Caroline's name, flashing on the screen. I let it ring, each chime a small rebellion, until it went to voicemail. She called again 10 minutes later, then a third time, her persistence a mirror to her desperation. I didn't answer. Silence was my weapon now, a way to let her feel the void she'd tried to create in my place. When the fourth call came, she left a message, her voice tight, practiced, the kind she used in boardrooms. Mom, we need to talk. What you did last night was unfair. Call me back, unfair. The word was almost laughable, coming from the woman who'd tried to declare me incompetent to seize my home. I deleted the message, my fingers steady, and turned back to the table. The metal box glinted under the morning light, its keyhole a taunt. I'd taken it to the party not knowing why, only that it felt like a piece of herald, a piece of the truth I was chasing. I ran my fingers over its surface, feeling the faint etchings of time, and wondered what it held. A letter, a deed, something more. The key was still out there, buried in the earth or hidden in the house, and I was determined to find it. Before I could dwell further, a knock at the door startled me. It was Sarah, her hair a mess, her eyes bright with the kind of energy that only youth can carry. She held 2 coffees and a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon and warmth. "Morning, Grandma," she said, kicking off her boots and stepping inside. "Figured you'd need fuel after last night's epic showdown." I smiled the warmth of her presence, cutting through the house's stillness. "You're up early," I said, taking a coffee from her. "Couldn't sleep." "Not after that," she said, flopping onto the couch with a grin. "You're like, I don't know, a queen walking into battle. Mom's probably still picking up the pieces of her ego." I laughed, a sound that surprised me with its lightness. "She'll survive," I said, settling into Harold's chair. "But I don't think she'll forget." Sarah's grin faded, her eyes softening as she leaned forward. "You okay, though? I mean, that was big. Showing up, calling her out in front of everyone, it took guts." I sipped my coffee, letting the questions settle. Was I okay? The fire in my chest hadn't dimmed, but it was tempered now by a quiet certainty, a strength I hadn't known I still had. "I'm more than okay," I said finally. "I'm awake." She nodded, her eyes on the metal box. "What's that thing anyway?" "You pulled it out last night like it was a grenade." I hesitated, my fingers brushing the box's surface. I hadn't told her about the notebook, the map, or the basement diagram, not yet. They were mine, a private pact with Harold, until I understood their meaning. But Sarah's trust, her unwavering belief in me, made me want to share, if only a piece. "It's something your grandfather left?" I said, my voice low. "Something I found under the lilacs." Her eyes widened, curiosity sparking. Under the lilacs. Like buried, I nodded, watching her closely. "Locked, though. I haven't found the key." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's intense. What do you think's inside?" "I don't know." I admitted, my gaze drifting to the notebook. "But it's important. He wouldn't have hidden it otherwise." Sarah reached for the box, turning it over in her hands. "This is straight out of a mystery novel," she said, half laughing. "Grandpa was sneaky. He was," I said, a smile tugging at my lips. "But he always had a reason." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that holds space for truth rather than stifling it. Sarah set the box down, her eyes meeting mine. "You're going to open it, right? Whatever's in there, you'll figure it out." "I will." I said the words a vow, but not yet. There's more to find. She nodded, her trust in me, a warmth that filled the room. "You're kind of unstoppable, you know that." I laughed again, the sound softer this time. "I'm learning." After Sarah left, promising to return for dinner, the house settled back into its quiet watchfulness. I carried the box and notebook to the living room, placing them on the mantel beside the photographs of Harold, Caroline, and Sarah. The phone buzzed again, another text from Caroline. "Mom, please. We can work this out. Call me." I ignored it, my focus on the box, the notebook, the map. Caroline's desperation was a distraction, not a bridge. But the distraction came anyway, in the form of a letter slipped through the mail slot that afternoon. It was in Caroline's handwriting, the envelope pristine, her name scrawled in the corner. I opened it expecting an apology, a justification, something to smooth over the cracks I'd exposed. Instead, it was a performance, 3 pages of carefully crafted words that danced around accountability. "I only want what's best for you," she wrote. "The trust was to protect you, to make things easier. I'm hurt you'd think otherwise." Hurt. As if she were the victim, as if my defiance at her party had wounded her more than her betrayal had wounded me. I set the letter down, my hands steady, my heart unmoved. It wasn't an apology. It was a script, a way to shift the narrative back to her control. I didn't need her words. I had Harold's etched in ink and earth guiding me toward a truth she couldn't touch. That evening, I returned to the basement driven by the diagram Harold had left. The circled corner was still there, the concrete smooth and unyielding its faint seam, a secret I couldn't yet crack. I knelt my flashlight, casting long shadows, and ran my fingers over the surface, searching for a clue, a weakness. Nothing. But as I stood, the flashlight beam caught something, a faint scratch in the concrete, barely visible, shaped like a tiny star. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, a mark Harold had made. My heart quickened, the air in the basement thickening with possibility. I pressed my fingers to the star, feeling a faint ridge, as if it were a hinge or a lock. I didn't have the tools to break it open, but I knew now the key wasn't just for the box. It was for this too, whatever was hidden beneath the concrete. I stood, my knees aching, and whispered to the empty room, "You're clever, Harold, but I'm catching up." The next day, I called a locksmith, a gruff man named Tom, who arrived with a toolbox that clinked like a treasure chest. He examined the metal box, his fingers tracing the keyhole. "Old," he said, his voice rough. "Custom lock. You'd need the exact key, or I'd have to drill it open, but that'd damage whatever's inside." "Don't drill it," I said quickly, my hand brushing the box. "I'll find the key." He raised an eyebrow, his eyes curious but not prying. "You got a lead on it. I'm working on it," I said, my voice steady. "Thank you, Tom." As he left, I felt the house shift its walls, seeming to lean closer, listening. The star in the basement, the X under the lilacs, the locked box, they were pieces of a puzzle, and I was closer than ever to solving it. Caroline's letter, her calls, her attempts to pull me back into her narrative, they were noise, nothing more. The real story was here in the earth, in the concrete, in the secrets Harold had left for me. Sarah came for dinner as promised, bringing a homemade lasagna that filled the house with warmth. We ate at the kitchen table, the box and notebook tucked away in my purse, their presence a quiet undercurrent to our conversation. She talked about her classes, her dreams, her quiet rebellion against her mother's expectations. I listened, my heart swelling with pride, with gratitude. She was the future I was fighting for, not just a house or a trust, but a legacy of seeing, of listening, of truth. After dinner, I showed her the letter I'd written to her, the one I had sealed but hadn't yet given. "This is for you," I said, handing it to her. "Not now, but when you need it." She took it, her eyes serious. "Grandma, you don't have to." "I do," I said, cutting her off gently. "Because you see me. And that's worth everything." She hugged me, her arms tight, and for a moment the house felt alive with more than secrets. It felt alive with love. The next morning, I returned to Feldman's office, the box and notebook in my purse, the new trust documents finalized in my mind. He greeted me with a nod, his cautious smile replaced by something closer to respect. "Mrs. Sloane," he said, gesturing to the private room. "Everything's in order. Sarah's named as the beneficiary, no incapacity clause, conditions locked as you requested." I read every line, my glasses slipping slightly, my eyes sharp despite the years. The documents were clean, precise, a fortress against Caroline's control. I signed them my cursive. Steady, the scratch of the pen, a sound of victory. "Thank you, Mr. Feldman," I said, rising. "You've been fair." He smiled, a real smile this time. "You're a force, Mrs. Sloane." I nodded, my purse heavy with the box and notebook. I'm learning that. As I left, I felt the weight of Caroline's letter, her calls, her attempts to pull me back into her world. They were nothing compared to the weight of the box, the notebook, the secrets I was uncovering. She thought she could control me, but she didn't know the half of it. The key was out there, and with it, the truth. I was closer than ever, and I wasn't stopping. The house felt lighter now, as if it had exhaled a long-held breath. The lilacs outside swayed gently in the late September breeze, their shadows soft against the windows, no longer restless but serene, like guardians who'd fulfilled their duty. On the kitchen table, the metal box sat open at last. Its contents revealed a small brass key, a letter from Harold, and a single pressed lilac petal, its purple faded but still vibrant with memory. The notebook lay beside it. Harold's words. "The house keeps its secrets. Miriam, but they're yours to find now, a promise fulfilled." The key had unlocked more than the box, it had unlocked me. It was Sarah who had found the key, though not by chance. 2 days after the party, she'd come over with coffee and questions, her eyes lingering on the box. "You still haven't opened it?" she'd asked, her voice teasing but curious. I'd shown her the basement diagram, the star-shaped scratch in the concrete, and she'd insisted on investigating. Together, we'd pried at the seam, her young hands stronger than mine, until a small panel gave way, revealing a hollow space. Inside was the key wrapped in a scrap of cloth, nestled beside a note in Harold's handwriting. "For Miriam, always." The key fit the box perfectly, its click a sound of completion. The letter inside was short but heavy with truth. "Miriam, you were always the heart of this house. The box holds our story, not just the deed or the money, but us, our love, our fights, our lilacs. Keep it safe. Keep yourself safe. You're stronger than they know." Folded with the letter was a second deed to the house, one I'd never seen, naming me as the sole owner, free of any trust or claim. Harold had known even then that I'd need to fight for my place. I stood now in the lawyer's office, the same polished room where this journey had begun. Cameron Feldman sat across from me, his tie looser, his smile genuine. Sarah was by my side, her presence a warmth that grounded me. Caroline and Philip sat opposite, their faces tight, their silence louder than any words. The new trust documents were on the table, naming Sarah as the beneficiary, locked with conditions no one could challenge. But I wasn't here to gloat. I was here to finish what I'd started. "I have something to say," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of 72 years and a truth newly uncovered. I pulled a letter from my purse, not the one from Harold, but one I'd written last night in the quiet of the house that was now fully mine. I unfolded it, my hands steady, and began to read. "Caroline," I said, my eyes meeting hers. "You thought I was fading, a shadow to be managed. You thought a signature could erase me, a clause could split me. But I'm not a clause. I'm not a problem. I'm your mother, and I built this life with my hands, my heart, my choices. This house, this legacy is mine to give, and I give it to Sarah, not because she's better, but because she sees me. She listens. She knocks before she enters." Sarah's hand found mine under the table, her fingers warm, her breath catching. Caroline's face was a mask, but her eyes betrayed her anger, shame, maybe even regret. Philip looked away, his hands clasped, as if he could will himself invisible. The room was silent, the air thick with the weight of my words. "I'm not here to divide us." I continued, my voice softening but unyielding. I'm here to be seen while I'm still here. You tried to write my ending, Caroline, but I am writing it myself, and it's not over yet. I folded the letter, placing it on the table like a seal on my truth. Feldman cleared his throat, his eyes flickering with something like awe. Mrs. Sloane, he said the documents are finalized. The trust is airtight. Is there anything else? No, I said, rising my purse lighter now, without the box's mystery but heavier with purpose. That's all. Sarah stood with me, her arm linked through mine, and we walked out together, leaving Caroline and Philip in the silence they'd created. The hallway was cool, the air sharp with the scent of rain, and as we stepped outside, I felt a weight lift like a curtain falling on a stage I had outgrown. 6 weeks later, the house was my sanctuary again, its walls no longer restless, but alive with memory. The lilacs bloomed early, a soft purple against the October sky, their scent a reminder of Harold, of us. Sarah came by often, her visits a rhythm I cherished. Coffee, laughter, stories about her dreams. Caroline hadn't called since the lawyer's office, her silence a choice I didn't question. Philip sent a text once, a vague offer to talk, but I didn't reply. I didn't need their words anymore. I had my own. The basement corner, once a mystery, was now just a corner. The concrete panel replaced the star-shaped scratch, a quiet memory. The deed from the box was filed. My ownership unquestionable, a gift from Harold that Caroline could never touch. The pressed lilac petal was framed, now hanging above the mantel beside our photographs, a piece of our story that needed no key. I sat in Harold's chair one evening, the notebook open before me, its pages no longer blank but filled with my words. I'm not done yet. I'd written that first night, and I hadn't been. I'd added more, since thoughts, memories, promises to myself. Age doesn't erase you, it sharpens you. The house is mine, but so am I. The notebook was my testament, a record of a woman who'd refused to be invisible. Sarah arrived, her boots clattering on the porch, her voice calling out before she'd even opened the door. "Grandma, I brought pie," she announced, holding up a tin that smelled of apples and cinnamon. She paused, her eyes catching the framed petal on the mantel. "That's new," she said, smiling. "It's old." I corrected my voice, soft. "But I'm seeing it now." She sat across from me, slicing the pie with a grin. "You're different, you know, since the party, like you've, I don't know, come alive." I smiled, the warmth of her words settling in my chest. "I was always alive, sweetheart. I just forgot for a while." We ate in companionable silence, the house humming around us, its secrets no longer burdens but gifts. The box, the key, the deed, they weren't just Harold's legacy. They were mine. A reminder that I was the heart of this house, the keeper of its story. Caroline had tried to erase me, but she'd failed. The world had tried to make me invisible, but I had refused. As Sarah left, her hug tight and fierce, I stood on the porch, the lilacs glowing under the moonlight. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. I didn't need Caroline's apologies, Philip's explanations, or the world's approval. I had the key, the truth, and myself. And that was enough. I walked back inside, my steps steady, my heart full. The notebook lay open on the table, and I picked up the pen, adding one final line. "I am Miriam Sloane, and I am free." The house sighed a soft creak of agreement, and I knew it was true.